Okay, hi, welcome to the History 101 World History course lectures. These are going to be weekly um, narrated PowerPoints that usually they go along with and actually supplement assigned chapters of the textbook. I don't just repeat everything the textbook says. These are considered to be independent um, of the textbook. Sometimes their ideas overlap, sometimes there's additional ideas. So make sure you do the reading and do these. Okay, so first point here, a couple points to orient you. This week, these first two do not coincide with any chapter of the textbook. I mentioned to you in the first class, you may remember, that we're not using chapter 1 of the textbook at all. And I told you I would say why. Well, briefly, the reason we're not doing it is because it's not history. One of the questions that we try to understand early in the course is what is history itself. And history is not everything that happened, or history is not in the past, and history is not everything that happened in the past that can be known by any means. History is an interpretation of sources that are produced in some way consciously by human beings. Interpretation, sources produced consciously. So what that means, first of all, is in terms of the sources, archaeology is a study. It's something completely separate from history that examines, that digs in the earth and uses scientific techniques to date and determine meaning of objects that are residuals or left behind by human societies. Those objects could be consciously created by humans. They could be to communicate, consciously created to communicate, right? Consciously created to say something, and that's actually another piece of it. A farm implement, for example, picked up, is consciously created, but not designed to say something. It's designed to produce crops. So that's not a historical source, but it is an archaeological source. Anthropology is a discipline, another discipline that's not history, that also digs in the earth to determine human experiences in the past through bones, the excavation of human bones and bones that humans used in animals and other things. Those are, again, valuable fields. They are not history. Humans do not produce their own bones to communicate something. And so, history of evolutionary biology. Evolutionary biology is not history. It is another interesting and important field, but it is not studying something. It's not studying sources that humans produced consciously to communicate something. The first chapter of the textbook goes back well beyond the historical record and talks about things from other fields that are not history. So as to avoid confusing you, into thinking that everything that is acquired from the past is history, we're not going to do it. We're not going to deal with it. Instead, what I'm going to talk to you about is the period that is from the beginning of human conscious production of sources that are intended to communicate something, orally or written sources, eventually. We're going to talk about the point right before permanent settlement of human societies, the creation of human societies into permanent settlements that lasted over the centuries. I'll explain what that means as we go, but we're going to instead start with oral culture and tribal experience. Tribe, the word I should note before we continue here, is just a English word that describes a group conceived and group organized human community of the past that was seen as having descended from a common ancestor, a common founder. It was basically the universal form of human organization. It has nothing to do with one particular society or one particular people or tribal and others aren't. Everybody was. It has to do with an organizational form. So when we begin here in part 1, I says here the ancient Near East, which is basically or roughly equivalent to what we would call the Middle East. People in this part of the world were tribal and nomadic, meaning that they wandered looking for food and water, settling temporarily in places when they found it, and moving on when they when they needed to go and find food and water. They moved as groups, and that was for various reasons, but that was basically the most effective and the actual form of organization in ancient societies. Okay. Okay, so next question here is, where are we going to be focusing on? This is a course called World History, but in 15 weeks, World History from the ancient world until about 1500. Well, we can't obviously talk about the whole world in 15 weeks, making any sense of anything from the ancient past all through up to that time. So we have to choose. Any world history course has to choose. And what I've chosen, and I'll explain why, is to focus on Eurasia and Africa. What does that mean? That means the continents of Asia and Europe, which are independent continents, but they're linked. Right? So this part of the world, right? Africa is a continent that's also linked by a very narrow land bridge. So that collection of places, which actually will start with something in Asia, the Middle East, then we're going to go to North Africa, and we'll only talk about things to do with Europe later in the course. We're not going to talk about Australasia. We're not going to talk about the Arctic or the Antarctic, those continents, and we're not going to talk about the Americas. Okay, this is not a history of continents. It's also, as you see, not a history of everything. Well, why are we talking about these places, Eurasia and Africa, and not these others? Well, for one reason being what I said before about the impossibility of covering everything. The other thing is there are courses in the history of the Americas that are dedicated to that, and the historical record of what's going on there is much more difficult to deal with in the very earliest period, or have an historical record, than there is comparing it to the ancient river valleys of Africa and Asia. So we're going to, since the earliest records are found in Africa and Asia, we're going to follow the sources. And it turns out that the earliest human permanent lasting settlements are in those places. So we're going to follow that sequentially. So it's sources and sequence, and lack of the ability to talk about everything. If this were a year-long course, it'd be different. This is one semester. Okay. So we're going to start ultimately in this part of the world, which is, if you look here, the Mediterranean Sea. On the map that I had before, you can see where the Mediterranean Sea is, and you will see right above it is this part called modern Turkey, which is something known as Anatolia in the ancient world. Here's the Nile Valley of Northeast Africa, and here is the modern Middle East. Okay, you see the modern countries' names here: Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and so forth. But in the ancient world, these countries don't exist. What we're going to be talking about is tribal, nomadic wandering in this part of the world, the ancient what is known as the Near East in the ancient world, or again Middle East. And we're going to talk about tribal and oral culture and oral tribal experience in this part of the world, right to the point of, and then after that, the point of permanent lasting settlement in this river valley. All the earliest settlements were in river valleys for obvious reasons, because of the accessibility of water at the Tigris and Euphrates Valley. So that's what we're going to end up talking about in the first chapter that we are going to cover in the textbook, and also which is chapter 2, which will be assigned. You can see on the syllabus when it's assigned, and also which I'll talk about when we get to permanent lasting settlement. Okay. We're then going to go to the Nile River Valley in Northeast Africa. Would be very possible to, in next chapter, it'd be very possible to start with the Nile Valley and then do the Tigris and Euphrates next. According to all the evidence, these places were permanently settled around the same time, maybe slightly earlier, although the record is very difficult to date in the very ancient world, about 3,000, 3,500 BC. Maybe the Nile valleys, the Tigris and Euphrates Valley slightly earlier, but around the same time. But the textbook organizes the way it does. We'll do it that way. So first the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, the Nile River Valley. After that, we will cover the Yellow River Valley, which is the Huanghu Valley in Chinese, which is the next place of permanent lasting settlement of human beings in the ancient world. Finally, we will end up at the last chapter and the last set of lectures before the midterm exam, the last textbook chapter and the last set of lectures in the Indus River Valley, which is the river valley of the what is modern India. Okay, found in modern India in Southwest Asia. Okay, so that's where we're headed. Kind of the plot of the beginning of the semester up to the midterm topically, and then but we're going to again start with, as I said to you before, oral culture and tribal organization, which is the background of all of these places before permanent lasting settlement in any of these river valleys. So that's where we're going to move now. Okay, so the question is, when are we talking about when we begin this course? Well, we're talking about the time frame right before about 3500 BC. Now, there's two issues here that are brought up. Number one is, what do we mean by BC or BCE as the other variation? And the other question is, why are we starting at this time frame? Or what do I mean by right before that time frame? When before? Okay, so let's talk about each one in turn. First of all, one of the exercises soon on Friday is going to talk a little bit about time and calendars. But the point I want to make here just very briefly is, when you think about time, historical time, you have to first of all understand the concept of the calendar that is the dominant calendar globally now in international institutions and business, which is a calendar that was developed by the Roman Empire, actually a couple of thousand years ago. The calendar that we use now is the way we calculate dates, years. This is 2020, right? But 2020 what? Well, technically, it's called 2020 AD, or in another system of abbreviation, 2020 CE. We don't write those letters after 2020 because the assumption is that if you just write a year, it is AD or CE, meaning it would be 2020 on like a positive numbers on a number line. If you see in the book, and you will see, the abbreviation BC and or BCE, your textbook uses BC. The Confucius book we'll read in a few weeks uses BC. Or the textbook uses BCE, and the book, the Confucius, uses BC. What is this in reference to? Well, the calendar 2020 refers to 2020 years from a certain theoretical zero event, a year zero. And 3500 BC refers to 3500 years before that zero event. The abbreviation BC gives us the answer to what that zero event is. It's before Christ is what it stands for. This means that the Romans, when they set up their calendar, about the calendar that we use now, about 1700 years ago, they believed that the most essential point in human history, a turning point beyond all turning points, was the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. The fact that we use the calendar shows that the influence of the Roman Empire, the people who created that calendar, and the societies which grew out of it. Okay, we'll be getting to that much later in the semester. But the bottom line is that's what the theoretical zero point is. 2020 years after, approximately, the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. That's the fact of what the calendar measures. BC 3500 then is 3500 years before that 0 point on the number line. Right? 2020 is 2020 years after that point. Okay, so if you want to talk about how much time is passed from 3500 BC, or how long ago 3500 BC is, we have to say, we have to add the numbers together like you would with math on a number line. 2020 years plus the 3,500 years going backwards from zero. That means about 5,500 years, 500 years ago, 5,520. Now, the 3,500, so remember that, okay, whenever you're reading, you will always see BC or BCE if it's one of these periods in the negative from before that 0 point. And if you don't see anything or any letters, then you know it's automatically what the abbreviation of either AD or CE, okay? The exercise will explain to you what those different abbreviations mean when you get to a Friday discussion. For our purposes then, right now, we just need to understand that when we say we're going to start before 3,500 BC in the course, we mean that we're starting about 5,500 years ago, approximately. Remember, too, that I'm going to say the word approximately a lot when we talk about dating, dates in the first half of the semester, because dating in the ancient world, establishing dates of things is very, very difficult for the early period of human settlement for a number of reasons. Certainly establishing precise dating is very difficult. Proximate dating is another matter.